Okay, welcome to General Biology, Chapter 1. This is the textbook everyone should have for this course. This is the cover. This is also in your syllabus. All right, let's start with the basics. So, what is biology? Now, biology can be broken down into prefix and suffix. So, bio means life. Therefore, biology, first of all, ology, everyone should know this. If not, you should remember it. Ology means the study of. So we have biology, psychology, right? Okay, so put those two together. Biology, if bio means life and ology means the study of, what does biology mean? The study of life. Okay, this is something that you should note as we go through. All right, so a lot of people wonder, why is biology important and why do I have to take this class and that sort of thing. And that is a valid question. So one of the things that I always tell my students is the reason why you take this class is, number one, it's part of your GEs, your general education. And as we produce college graduates, we want you to come out of college as a well-rounded individual that has knowledge in various subjects. That's one of the reasons. The other reason why is because biology is a huge staple in our world and we use it every single day of our lives. We can't, it explains our biological disposition of life as well as our surroundings. Okay, so let's start just kind of ticking off a couple of things. So the study of ecology, agriculture, the whole agricultural system relies on the science of biology. The justice system, okay, now at one point in time, the justice system was a little bit terrifying actually because of the fact that people were wrongfully arrested because we didn't have DNA technology, we didn't have DNA evidence, and they would rely on witnesses, and that brings into question human error. So if an innocent person was ID'd by a witness, then basically they could go to prison for the majority of their life. And this is not anything new. There's many stories about people being wrongfully incarcerated because at that time there was no DNA technology. All right, so we'll talk a little bit more about some of that stuff later. Now, some of the most important things is research, okay, and specifically researching diseases. And then not just the research of disease, but the treatment of disease. Okay, so medication and treatment. So I'm going to show you guys a quick video about one of the single most important discoveries in history when it comes to science.
Imagine a world before antibiotics. This is a world where a paper cut to your finger could result in amputation, where mothers feared for the wellness of their children. It was a world where bacteria were beating mankind.
We had started already to think about prevention, and the sanitary revolution in the mid-1800s did tremendous things for preventing infectious diseases, but antibiotics, without a doubt, revolutionized how we could treat people. Antibiotics are one of the greatest medical breakthroughs of man. They've saved hundreds of millions to billions of lives since they were first identified in the early 1900s. Penicillin was an amazing breakthrough that occurred thanks to Alexander Fleming, who rediscovered the antibiotics.
It's the classic story of invention. An accident. Fleming comes back from vacation, petri dishes of his precious bacteria killed off by fungi, and instead of throwing them away, which almost everyone would have done, he looks at that petri dish with the dead bacteria and sees a chance to change the course of human life.
penicillin, all of a sudden, we were no longer just talking about prevention of infectious diseases, we started talking about treatment of infectious diseases, which gave us a brand new weapon to take on microbes.
The development of penicillin has allowed the human population to dramatically increase because most of us don't die anymore, thankfully, from infectious disease.
To this day, this cat and mouse game continues between humans and microbes. So as we become more intelligent about prevention methods and vaccines and antibiotics, the microbes also become increasingly crafty and look for kinks in our armor where they can find some way to get through and multiply and grow.
Only through our ingenuity and the ability to look for different clues to what allows those bacteria to thrive can we ultimately beat them.
All right, so why is science and medicine so important? Well, literally, science and medicine has saved lives and it has completely changed the world. So if we go all the way back, this is 12,000 BC over here, okay? Now look closely at this graph at what we're actually looking at. We're going back in time, right? And all the way to 2011, it wraps around. And it's also measuring the number in billions, okay, from 0 to 7 billion. And yes, this is a little bit older and our numbers have gone up, but it's still an incredibly relative graph. Okay, so these are the facts, basically. This is a human population measured. Okay, it's pretty low. And then we see some technical advances that occur, and it starts to increase a little bit. Then we get agricultural advances around this time frame, and it goes up a little bit more. But see how it's pretty stable, and it kind of stays like that for a while, quite a bit of time, okay? And then we have this big dip because of the bubonic plague, which was horrifying. I mean, you can see it on the graph. It wiped out a lot of people. Okay, now, finally, late 1800s, things start to change, mostly because of medical advances. The discovery of penicillin, for example, the discovery of vaccines for terrible diseases that are basically incurable. You have to have a vaccine for it, like the measles, the mumps, the whooping cough, all of those things. Okay, now, once those things were kind of put into motion and they were utilized by the general population around the world, what happens then? Well, we grow exponentially, and the human population has not stopped growing. In fact, we've grown so much that we are over 7 billion people on this planet at this point, and we are now overpopulated because of the medical advancements. And that's a different issue, and that's really not, that's a more of a political issue. The fact is that science literally saves lives, and so much so that we have grown exponentially and have not stopped growing since these advancements. Okay, so that is why science and medicine are so important, and that's why biology is important. This is why, basically we want everyone to try to learn this stuff, because it does matter to your life. It's not this invisible world that doesn't matter to you. It matters to everyone in your life, your family, your children, your parents, whatever, yourself, okay? And knowing a little bit about it will give you a leg up on being able to discuss big issues. All right, so let's start from the very beginning before we get into the big issues. So now let's start with very basic, simple things. Okay, if biology is the study of life, then what constitutes life? There has to be, some kind of classification. Biologists love to organize and basically categorize everything. There is a standard. Now, okay, in order for something to be technically alive, life, it has to have these 7 properties: order, reproduction, growth and development, energy processing, regulation, respond to the environment, and I'm going to talk about each and every one of these in more detail, and evolutionary adaptations. Okay, this is just an intro. All right, so let's look at what that means. What do they mean by order? We'll start with that one. Well, order specifically is in reference to the incredibly high organization of living organisms. Now, we can look at something like this sunflower, and it's incredibly strategically organized, and nothing is random here. And it's just not. And the same thing goes for the human body. Your body's not just, piles of fluids or tissue. Absolutely not. They're structured into cells, which are structured into tissue, which are structured into organs and organ systems. And you're incredibly organized. And so is every living thing on the planet. Okay, that's technically alive. Okay, we'll leave it at that. Reproduction is very straightforward. Reproduction is being able to pass DNA from parent to offspring. So here we see a little baby elephant and a mama elephant. But really, the whole point of reproduction is being able to pass DNA from parent to offspring. Okay, that is what reproduction truly is. All right, growth and development, that's obvious, right? You don't just pop into existence as an adult, and neither does anything else that's alive, really. They start off as, in this case, this is an animal, so they're going to start off as a single-celled zygote, and they will grow into the organism that they're supposed to be based on their DNA. And this little guy's hatching, but he didn't start off life that way, right? Absolutely not. All right, so everything that's alive has to grow and develop over time, and their growth and development is controlled by their DNA structure. Okay, energy processing. Okay, this is pretty straightforward. All living organisms need energy to operate. All living organisms can perform something called cellular respiration, including us and including almost every animal on the planet or living organism on the planet can process energy through either cellular respiration, aerobic or anaerobic. But specifically, the fact is every living organism, even this caterpillar, even this plant that it's on, even bacteria, things like that can perform cellular respiration. And in a nutshell, cellular respiration takes glucose. Glucose is sugar and can break it down into energy, cellular energy called ATP. All right, regulation. Okay, so regulation. Now, what this means is that living organisms have to be able to regulate their own internal environment. Okay, so for example, our bodies are controlled through homeostasis. Okay, so everything in your body, for example, is controlled by your systems. Okay, for example, our body's temperature, thermoregulation is controlled. It can't go too low, can't go too high. If your temperature goes up, that means something's wrong, right? If you have a fever, that means you might be sick. And ultimately, if you're healthy, then your body temperature should be perfect. Okay, your blood pH should be perfect. Your blood volume should be perfect. Your O2 level should be perfect. And that's because our system can regulate its own internal environment without being told to do so. Now, living organisms can mostly do the same thing. Some of them can't, like this little guy. He is laying on this rock clearly because he's ectothermic and he's just getting heat. But mostly he can regulate the rest of his body, just not the heat. Okay, so controlling an organism's internal environment is what regulation means. And specifically, homeostasis plays a big role in that regulation. Okay, so what is homeostasis? Homeostasis means balance. Okay, so homeostatic conditions are controlled by something called a negative feedback loop. Okay, so what does that mean? Now, first of all, if you look closely at this graph, see how it says glucose norm. And then it says there's a straight line across and it says no deviation. And on the other side, it says glucose norm. That means we're measuring, this is just an example, okay? We're measuring blood glucose and it's normal inside of the body. And this no deviation, this basically perfect balance, that is homeostasis. The no deviation part, the perfect balance, it's perfect, balanced, no disturbances. Okay, now let's say you eat something. Your glucose is going to spike. It's going to increase. However, your body will respond. A healthy individual will respond, and immediately you have pancreatic receptors that can detect that spike in blood glucose. And those pancreatic receptors will release insulin and will cause the liver to pull the glucose out of the blood and put it away, store it as something called glycogen, returning blood glucose back to normal. Okay, all of this is happening inside of your body every time you eat something without your knowledge or control. Okay, that is a negative feedback loop because this is a negative response and then it's fixed and regulated and brought back to homeostasis. That's one negative feedback loop. On the bottom, this is a separate negative feedback loop. It's just connecting the same concept. So for example, let's say a person's blood glucose decreases. Could be because they're not really eating that much sugar. And this is actually a diet, which everybody knows about at this point. If you cut out your carbs, your body will start to pull fats for energy and then start pulling sugars from your liver and so on. Either way, it doesn't matter. The fact is this. Okay, let's say you haven't had a lot of carbs or they're dropped, your glucose has dropped. Okay, your body's going to respond instantly. Okay, pancreatic receptors that are designed to respond to that will immediately instruct the liver to release glucose. Okay, so we have glycogen, which is a chain of glucose stored in the liver all the time. Okay, and we'll talk more about glycogen later. Okay, and the liver will immediately release glucose and bring your blood glucose back to normal. All right, now the takeaway from this whole thing is number one, homeostasis is perfection, basically perfect balance of everything in your body. In this example, we're talking about blood glucose, but this applies to your temperature, this applies to your blood volume, this applies to everything. Okay, any disturbance, right? And specifically, homeostasis is controlled by a negative feedback loop. They are the only things that can restore the body's disturbance. Okay, together a negative feedback loop it basically triggers the homeostatic response. All right, let's go on. Responding to the environment is another characteristic of living organisms. Okay, we respond to our environment. We have sensory organs, we have nerves, but however, there are more simple organisms that can respond to their environment. Here, we see this plant and this sitting in the window. And notice how it's grown towards the window because why? Because of the sun, because of sunlight, because plants need sunlight. Okay, now that's interesting because a plant doesn't have a brain. Doesn't matter. It can still respond to the environment. Same thing with this Venus flytrap. Snap, it can respond to the environment because it has the ability to do so. So, all right, what about evolutionary adaptations? Now, evolutionary adaptations are basically changes that have occurred, or basically an organism has evolved over many generations. So here we're looking at the snow owl. Now, it's not a coincidence that the snow owl is white and its environment is also white. Do you see how perfect this little guy matches his environment? Not only is he white, but he also has these little tiny specks on him that are the same color as the local brush. Now that is because of evolutionary adaptations. These organisms have evolved over many generations, and individuals that have the best genes, traits, they've been passing down their DNA for hundreds of years, thousands of years, and that is what evolutionary adaptation is. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue this chapter. The next thing we're looking at is called the biological hierarchy. Okay, so we just looked at the 7 properties that characterize living organisms. This is somewhat different. This is different. This is the biological hierarchy of life. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and start from the smallest, which is over here, and I'm going to move upwards. Okay, so basically, everything in this world, everything is made up of atoms. Okay, atoms. And atoms come together and they make molecules. They make molecules. Okay, we're using examples here. Here, the example is DNA, which is actually a macromolecule. Okay, so atoms come together to make molecules. Molecules come together and they make up our organelles. So we have something inside of our cells called organelles. The nucleus is a great example. Okay, organelles make up our cells. Here the example is a nerve cell. So this is a nerve cell. This is what a neuron looks like. Okay, cells that share a function make up tissue. For example, if we're talking about a nerve cell, the nerve is tissue, is a combination or a group of neurons or nerve cells. Okay, now tissue that have the same function will make up an organ. In this example, it's the brain. Okay, organs that share a function will make the organ system. For example, the nervous system. The nervous system is the brain, the spinal cord, and all of the nerves in the body. Okay, now the human body, we have 11 organ systems, and they all come together to make one organism. Here, this is the American alligator, which is fine. But the fact is, they also have several systems, not just one, right? So organ systems collaborate or combine to make an organism, which would be a human body or this alligator. The next hierarchy, which is more inclusive, is population. Okay, so many of the same organism inhabiting the same area is a population. So here we're looking at a group of alligators inside of the wetlands of Florida. And because they are the same species in the same physical area, that is a population. Okay, the next level of the biological hierarchy is the community. Okay, a community is all of the organisms that live in that area. So here we are looking at population of alligators in the wetlands in Florida, right? Okay, now if you look at this picture, there's an alligator. Okay, there's also plants, trees, there's also another animal. So this is a community, all of the organisms inhabiting the wetlands, right? Then there's more. The next level of the biological hierarchy is the ecosystem. Okay, so the ecosystem takes into account everything from this point down, and then it adds some stuff. So the ecosystem is everything in the community plus non-living factors. Okay, what's something that's not alive? pH in the soil, temperature, water, climate, those kind of things. And then the highest, which includes every single ecosystem on the entire planet, is the biosphere. And there we are. That's our whole biosphere, everything in existence in this biosphere, in this planet. Okay, we're not talking outside of the planet Earth. Okay, that is the biological hierarchy of life, and you want to know it in order. All right, so this is just a closer look at, the biosphere is the most inclusive. It includes every ecosystem, like I said, what an ecosystem is versus community versus population versus organism. The next slide goes all the way from organism all the way down to atoms. All right. Now, other things that are taken into consideration when it comes to life is how energy moves through the world, how energy moves through an ecosystem more specifically, and not just energy, chemicals. Okay, now this is a very straightforward and very important. So let's start from the beginning. Okay, so what we're looking at here is an ecosystem, and it just is. It's a non-specific ecosystem. Okay, so let's see what we have going on. We have the sun. Okay, we have plants. Plants are referred to as producers. Okay, we have a moose here, which is an animal, and that would be considered a consumer. All right, now that's what we have labeled in regards to organisms. Now let's go ahead and see what's happening. All right, now first of all energy, all of it, comes from the sun. All of it. It doesn't matter how you receive your energy. It used to belong to the sun at one point in time. Okay, so all of energy on Earth comes from the sun. Typically, the pattern of flow is as follows. Producers, plants, okay, they are capable of something called photosynthesis, and they can turn that solar energy that comes from the sun into chemical energy in the form of food, which we eat, and so do other animals. Okay, so consumers will eat, we'll just stick with the moose. Okay, he's eating this plant and getting his energy. And then inside the body will take that chemical energy and turn it into cellular energy. And so therefore, inside of an ecosystem, energy flows in one direction only. One way. Okay, from the sun to producers to consumers. Done. Now, chemicals, though. Chemicals are pretty interesting because they never leave the earth, and they never have. So we have chemicals that have been recycling this planet for 4.5 billion years. Yes, it's pretty incredible, but it's true. All right, so this is how it works. All right, so we have decomposers like worms, fungi, bacteria that can break down organic material, okay, and return it into chemical form back into the atmosphere. So let's say this animal, this moose, dies, okay, and dies naturally and is allowed to be decomposed into the soil, it will be broken down. It might take a long time, but it will happen. Okay, we have decomposers that'll take the organic body, all of the carbons and hydrogens and nitrogens and oxygens, and completely break them down and return them to the atmosphere. And I'm just going to diagram just a couple of these because there's so much more. I'm just going to put a couple. Okay, that's good enough. And eventually all of these chemicals in our atmosphere are taken up by organisms as well, and they are, for example, we inhale oxygen, exhale CO2, plants bring up CO2 and build sugars, and there's this big endless cycle with the chemicals. But one thing is important here, well, actually all of it's important, but really what you want to take away from this is chemicals are cycled. They're recycled. Basically, as long as this planet is here, they'll continue to do so. And so chemicals flow in a circle or a cycle. Energy does not. It has a one-way flow, and that's that. All right, that's what you wanted to, well, the other stuff is important as well, but that's kind of the big message here, okay? All right, now what about cells? Because cells are incredibly significant, so I'm going to introduce them now. Now, if you haven't noticed, I'll kind of clue you in a little bit. This is chapter 1, so this is an intro chapter. So what's happening here is you're being introduced to different topics. And then as we go through, our chapters are more concentrated. All right, so intro to cell. Very simple. Okay, we have two major types of cells, eukaryotic cells and prokaryotic cells. All right, the cell is the smallest unit of life. So it's the structural and functional unit of life. Okay, what does that mean? That means that anything smaller than a cell is not alive, and that's it. That's what it means. Okay, therefore, we can have single-celled organisms, and they can totally be alive, and that's fine. But anything smaller than that, absolutely not alive. All right, good enough. Cells are very sophisticated. They can regulate their own internal environment. They make energy. They can respond to the environment. And they have an incredibly complex organization. And guess what? They can reproduce. They can make new cells. Okay, now the primary difference between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, we're going to talk about the differences in detail in later chapters, but for now, the most important thing I want you to know right away is that eukaryotic cells have a nucleus. That is the main thing that differentiates them for now. Okay, there's other things that we'll discuss later. In other words, eukaryotic has a nucleus, prokaryotic does not, no nucleus. It does, however, have DNA. All right, we're going to do a compare and contrast of prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells. And really, at the end of the day, it's pretty straightforward. Now, I'll go ahead and start with what they have in common because that's the easiest thing to do. Okay, all cells, no matter what they are, they have DNA. Okay. I'll actually make a list here. Okay, all cells, meaning both, they have the following: DNA, a plasma, membrane, cytoplasm. Okay, and they actually do share this, ribosomes. Okay, but there are prokaryotic and eukaryotic ribosomes. Okay, that's what they have in common. And for now, we will leave it at that. Okay, let's talk a little bit about DNA. Now, what is DNA? DNA is your genetic blueprint. And for our cells, we have eukaryotic cells. Our cells are very sophisticated. Your DNA is packaged. Well, first of all, it's held in the nucleus. That's where it belongs. But DNA is packaged into units called chromosomes. This is a chromosome right here. Okay. But it's made up of DNA. All right. Now, the human body, we have 46 chromosomes. All right. And everything about you, everything, all your physical attributes, all your internal attributes, everything is written in your genetic blueprint, and every single person on the planet has unique DNA, except for identical twins. They are the exception. All right, so DNA makes up your genetic blueprint. It's packaged in 2 chromosomes. And then you have these segments. Okay, so a segment is a piece of DNA. I'm sorry, a gene is a segment, a piece of DNA that contains some type of information. So I want you to know that what a gene is. Okay, it's a segment of DNA. What a chromosome is, it's a packaged unit of genes and DNA, basically, and DNA makes up all of it. All right, so I mentioned this briefly. Okay, why do we care about DNA? Well, DNA and the discovery of being able to run a DNA panel has changed the world. It just really has changed the world. Before DNA testing, many people were wrongfully incarcerated. There's so many people that were wrongfully incarcerated that we actually have some pretty interesting things that have been going on since the 90s. One of them is called the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project is a team of attorneys and scientists that have been going around the country and opening up old cases that go all the way back into the 70s and basically reevaluating the evidence. And they've been able to solve some things that were and get people out of prison that were not the criminals. This is in regards to, old murder cases, old rape cases, things like that. Okay, so it's used in criminal investigations, of course, now because we know so much about it. And we can do DNA profiling, parental testing. That's a pretty easy one. But one of the greatest things about DNA is we now understand chromosome disorders and genetic disorders. Now, we're not that much closer to curing them, but we can at least understand them and treat them. For example, now the human body should have 46 chromosomes. People with Down syndrome, they have 47. This is just one defect. It happens during the egg or sperm formation, which we'll talk about later. But the whole point is, I want you to think about that. We're supposed to have 46 and that's it. People with Down syndrome have 47. Do you think that's extreme, that one extra chromosome leads to this severe disorder? There's some disorders that are fatal. So we didn't know, or they didn't know before, until DNA technology came into the picture, and now we understand. We understand quite a bit in regards to genes. Okay, we have something called the Human Genome Project that has deciphered all of the genes in the human body, and they're still figuring things out. And on top of that, we've been able to figure out what's going on with cancer. Why and how and where and which part of the DNA, which genes are mutated in cancers. And the biggest problem with curing cancer is this. If every single person has unique DNA, And cancer is a genetic DNA mutation, but everyone has unique DNA. Then how do you treat everyone the same? You cannot, is the answer. It's a very big problem. All right, let's move on. Let's go on to the diversity of life. So we've actually started talking about the diversity of life when I discussed the fact that every single living person and actually every living organism has unique DNA. Okay, now that is called diversity. Diversity, different, right? Diversity of life. Now let's move away from humans for a little bit. There are scientists that have been working out in the field for quite a bit of time, and they've dedicated their whole life to studying animals, the ecosystems, everything you can possibly think of out there is under research, right? And so what happens if a scientist discovers something new, like a new species, a new organism? It doesn't happen all the time, but if it does happen, there is a system in place that allows them to classify them. And this is called taxonomy. Taxonomy is a system utilized to name species and classify them into the correct taxonomic organization. All right, so basically we have this incredibly diverse world. They've discovered about almost 2 million species, okay, and they've identified them, classified them based on taxonomy, based on the rules of taxonomy. And really, in reality, they're thinking we have more like 10 to even possibly 100 million species. And these are probably more like microscopic organisms, but it doesn't matter. They're still alive, right? All right, so taxonomy is a system designed to name and classify organisms into their groups. All right, so how do you do that? Well, first of all, there's 3 total domains. And actually, before I get into this, let me actually be very specific about something. There's a way to do all of this, okay? Let me just quickly put this in here. We have a system, okay? The first is everything is placed into a domain, kingdom, phylum, okay. So everything's put into a domain, then a kingdom, then a phylum, oops, and a class, order, family, genus, and species. Oops. Okay, so this is the taxonomic organization. And then ultimately, they're given 2 names, the genus and species name. For example, us, humans, we are called Homo sapien because our genus is Homo and our species is sapien. Okay, so we get 2 names, and actually every organism gets 2 names, the genus and species. Now, how are you going to remember this? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Great way to remember that is like this. Drunk, king, hold on, actually. Okay, remember the letters first. Drunk King Philip came over from German soil, okay? Drunk King Philip came over from, oops. Okay, I think you guys are gonna get it anyways. German soil. Okay, even I remember it this way. And it's just a way to remember it. And it's silly, and really, honestly, you'll just remember it for the rest of your life. Just write the letters out first. Drunk King Philip came over from German soil. And in fact, what does that really mean? Domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. Remember that one. All right, so there's 3 possible domains that every living organism has to be classified into. Okay, the first domain, bacteria. Second, archaea. Third, eukarya. Okay, the domain bacteria is very simple. It has bacteria in it, all of them. Okay, and yes, they'll be put into different kingdoms and all of that sort of thing, and different genus and species, definitely. Okay, archaea they're microscopic organisms, but they are not bacteria. They're unique. Now, the domain eukarya is incredibly diverse. In fact, it's so diverse that we have everything from see this little guy right here? This is a living organism. This is a little tiny amoeba, okay, which is a protist. Well, that's its kingdom. All right, we have multiple kingdoms, okay, in this domain. They're all eukaryotic cells. Okay, we have protists, plants, fungi have their own kingdom, and animals. This is our kingdom. So no matter what the organism is, the fact is they can all be placed into one of the 3 domains, no matter what they are.
This episode of Stated Clearly was only possible with support from our viewers and from Brain Tools LLC, a company dedicated to developing and delivering to patients new treatments for Alzheimer's. Stated Clearly presents, what is natural selection? Natural selection is one of several key concepts contained within the theory of evolution. To understand exactly what natural selection is and why it's so important, let's first take a quick look at 2 other evolutionary concepts, descent with modification and the overarching idea of common descent. Descent with modification is the observable fact that when parents have children, those children often look and behave slightly different than their parents and slightly different than each other. They descend from their parents with modifications. The differences found in offspring are partially due to random genetic mutations. Common descent is the idea that all living things on Earth are related. They descended from a common ancestor. Through the gradual process of descent with modification over many, many generations, a single original species is thought to have given rise to all the life we see today. The common descent of all life on Earth is not a directly observable fact. We have no way of going back in time to watch it happen. Instead, common descent is a conclusion based on a massive collection of facts. Facts found independently in the study of fossils, genetics, comparative anatomy, mathematics, biochemistry, and species distribution. Because the evidence for common descent is so overwhelming, the concept has been around since ancient times. In the past, however, it was rejected by many philosophers and scientists for one main reason. You cannot get order and complexity from random chaos alone. The bodies and behaviors of living things are extremely complex and orderly. Descent with modification simply produces random variation. All through history, no one could explain how complex life arose from simple life through random variation until Charles Darwin discovered natural selection. Charles Darwin, who lived from 1809 to 1882, was a naturalist, someone who studies nature. At the start of his career, he traveled the world by ship, collecting and documenting plants and animals. During his travels, Darwin became very interested in the idea of common descent. He noticed that islands contained species of plants and animals unique to those islands, They can't be found anyplace else on Earth, but they often look and behave surprisingly similar to creatures found on nearby continents. Tortoises on the Galapagos Islands can be distinguished from those of Africa. Meanwhile, with the exception of size, they are almost identical to a species found nearby in South America. Darwin believed these similarities could be best explained through common descent. Long ago, a tortoise from the mainland may have drifted to the islands, possibly on a raft of storm debris, and once arriving, laid her eggs. Random changes caused by descent with modification over thousands of years eventually transformed the island creatures and the mainland creatures so much that they could no longer be considered the same species. This idea made good sense to Darwin, except for one thing. The island creatures he found weren't just randomly different from their mainland cousins. They were specially adapted for island life. The Galapagos is a collection of 18 main islands, many of which are home to tortoises. The larger islands have lots of grass and vegetation. Tortoises there grow extra heavy and have dome-like shells. Some of the smaller islands have very little grass, forcing the tortoises to feed on island cactus. The best cactus pads grow on the tops of these plants. Fortunately, tortoises on these islands are equipped with expanded front legs and saddle-like shells, allowing them to stretch their necks extra long to reach their food. It's almost as if these island creatures have been perfectly sculpted to survive within their unique environments. How did this sculpting take place? Random descent with modification alone could never do such a thing. Darwin drew upon his knowledge of selective breeding to answer this question. For thousands of years, farmers have been taking wild plants and animals, and through the process of selective breeding, have sculpted the original wild forms into new domestic forms, much better suited for human use and consumption. The process is slow but simple. If a single plant produces 100 seeds, most will grow to be nearly identical to the parent plant. A few, however, will be slightly different. Some variations will be undesirable, smaller size, bitter taste, vulnerability to disease, and so on. Other variations will be highly valued. Thicker, sweeter leaves, for example. If a farmer only allows the best plants to reproduce and create seeds for the next crop, small positive changes will add up over multiple generations, eventually producing a dramatically superior vegetable. You might be surprised to hear that broccoli, cauliflower, kale, Brussels sprouts, and cabbage are all just different breeds of a single type of weed commonly found along the shores of the English Channel. The evolution of this original plant into all the varieties we see today was carefully guided by different farmers around the world who simply selected for different traits. It's important to note that the farmer doesn't actually create anything. Random descent with modification creates new traits. The farmer simply chooses which of those new creations are allowed to reproduce and which are not. Darwin proposed that nature itself is also capable of selection. It may not have an intelligent brain like a farmer, but nature is an extremely dangerous place in which to live. There are germs which can kill you, animals that can eat you. You could die of heat exhaustion. You could die of exposure to the cold. When parents produce a variety of offspring, nature, simply by being difficult to survive in, decides which of those variations get to live and reproduce, and which do not. Over multiple generations, creatures become more and more fit for survival and reproduction within their specific environments. Darwin called this process natural selection. Since Darwin first put forth his idea in the mid-1800s, natural selection has been studied and witnessed numerous times in nature and in the science lab. What started out as a mere idea is now officially an observable fact. Darwin's discovery has greatly expanded our understanding of the natural world. It's led to countless new breakthroughs, and it finally allowed scientists to seriously consider the idea of common descent. So to sum things up, what exactly is natural selection? Natural selection is the process by which random evolutionary changes are selected for by nature in a consistent, orderly, non-random way. Through the process of descent with modification, new traits are randomly produced. Nature then carefully decides which of those new traits to keep. Positive changes add up over multiple generations. Negative traits are quickly discarded. Through this simple, ongoing process, nature, even though it does not have a thinking mind, is capable of producing incredibly complex and beautiful creations. I'm John Perry, and that's natural selection stated clearly.
Topic is called scientific method and beyond. All right, so the idea here is to get you guys thinking like a scientist. And every scientist, it doesn't matter which level they're at, whether they are in a biology 100 class like this, or if they are at the graduate level or doctoral level, it doesn't matter. We all use something called scientific method. Okay, so let's go ahead and start. In scientific method, questions are asked, and the idea is to try to answer some of these questions about natural phenomenon. In other words, not supernatural. That's not science. Okay, so the first step is an observation. So this can be an observation that you make with your eyes, right? That you physically see, but in reality, it's going to be built off of previous research. Okay. Then you ask a question based on the research that you've recently reviewed or based on your physical observation. And through that question, there has to be a formulated, unique, specific, testable hypothesis that is written. Okay, so in other words, a hypothesis has to be drawn up. What is a hypothesis? Okay, so a hypothesis is a proposal, an explanation for the observation, for the question, basically, for the observation. And it's an explanation, it's kind of predicting the outcome as well. And then it has to be testable. If you can't test it in the lab or out in the field, then this is kind of not going to work, right? You have to be able to test your question. Otherwise, it's really not a scientific experiment. Okay, so that's that. You run your experiment. Then you'll get data that you collect, and you'll have results. And then from your results, you draw your conclusion. Now, these are the steps of scientific method. And in every single experiment, we have to have something called a control, which is your baseline. Okay, it's your constant. And then we have an experimental group, which is the group that is manipulated or the variable that's manipulated. Okay, so in other words, you can look at it this way. Let's say we're doing a test on medication. Okay, the control, they would get like blanks, a placebo. The experimental would get the medication. That's the easiest, most clear way to put it. All right, so you want to know this diagram from scientific method. You will be doing a lab with scientific method and you'll learn a little bit more. So straightforward, we have an observation. Okay, from that observation, which is either a new observation made that with your physical, which is with your physical eyes, I guess you could say, or you've taken previous research and studied it, and then you've observed something new, something that no one's ever noticed before. And it happens. That's how science works. Okay, and then you give it an explanation, which is the hypothesis. This is input, a testable proposal. Okay, so then we have our experiment, and we can pull our data and collect it and understand what the data means. Now, the goal is to conclude one of two things. Do we accept or reject the hypothesis? Is the data supporting the hypothesis, or does it reject the hypothesis? So let's say your conclusion it completely does not support the hypothesis. You have to reject your hypothesis. So you go back to the drawing board and you tweak the hypothesis and try again. So if the experimental data does not support the hypothesis, in other words, your conclusion, your results are your conclusion is based on your results, and if it doesn't support your hypothesis, you have to reject the hypothesis. Right. Now, let's say you make a new hypothesis. Okay, you're going to have to start over. You'll make a new experiment, run the whole thing, and then let's say this time you get it right and your conclusion supports your hypothesis. Your work, if this was a completely legitimate study, would be contributed to scientific theory. Scientific theory is many experiments and observations that support the same theory. And over time, let's say this theory is supported over and over and over and over again for 50, 60, 100 years. Okay, we never say anything is a fact in science. We just don't, because the truth is that things can change down the line, and we can have new technology and figure something out. Some things are so embedded into science that they can't be discredited. But either way, we still refer to them as scientific theory. So let's say you go on and you publish this work. It gets contributed to scientific theory. Now, do not mix up scientific method and scientific theory. All right, now this is a very straightforward analysis of the scientific method. Okay, so here we go. We have a flashlight. Scientific method, the first step is observation. The flashlight doesn't work, that's the observation. Okay, your question. Why doesn't the flashlight work? So the first hypothesis, it says the batteries are dead. Okay, that's a hypothesis and it's a prediction, and it's giving us an explanation for this observation. Now, can we test that? Sure, why not? If the batteries are dead, what should you do? Obviously, we can replace the batteries. Now, we should say that, if we replace the batteries, this should fix the problem. So the experiment would be actually replacing the batteries. Okay, result. Okay, this didn't work. Therefore, we reject this hypothesis. I'm just going to put an R for reject. We go back to the drawing board and come up with hypothesis number 2. Okay, it's not the batteries, it's the bulb possibly. So we'll write a very direct hypothesis that's easy to test. Bulb is burned out. Easy. The test is replace the bulb. The light comes on, the hypothesis is supported, done. Okay, so we can go for something as simple as, everyday household obstacles to very complex research that's out in the world. But let's keep things simple because we're right here in a 100 level class. All right, so you want to know, again, the flow diagram of scientific method, and of course, the rest of the material that we covered in this chapter. And that is the end of chapter 1.